Welcome back to In the Shadows of Utopia. I'm Lachlan Peters. No extended prologue for this episode, we are going to just jump straight in. Just wanted to quickly mention a couple of new videos on the YouTube channel for those interested in the video essays I've been putting up there. Also, the next release for the podcast series will be a kind of bonus recap episode. We have covered a lot of time and space so far in the series, and I just want to have something that you can use to refresh your memory before we get to the second half of the 20th century, the Sihanouk years, the Cambodian Civil War, and the focus of the show, the rise and fall of the Khmer Rouge regime. That might be handy for new listeners as well, the people that just want to jump in the more modern history era, but also want to be filled in on some of the events and themes that we've covered already and will recur in the latter half of the series. So, yeah, expect that in the not too distant future. Also, as always, just want to thank everyone who has gotten in contact or left a positive review for the show, wherever you might be listening to it. And an extra thank you to those who have donated to the show via PayPal or Patreon. It isn't something I expect, but it is greatly appreciated and a big help. A quick update for those of you who have donated to the show. I'm working on some exclusive content for you supporters, a commentary track for the famous movie about Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge, 1984's The Killing Fields. So that should be available quite soon as well, so look out for that. As always, information about all of this stuff, as well as contact details, can be found on the website, www.shadowsofutopia.com. And that's that for housekeeping. Very excited about this episode, as we're going to basically close one very large chapter of the story, French Indochina. We will cover the end of the First Indochina War, the conference in Geneva and its consequences, and finally the 1955 elections in an independent Cambodia. We will see this hurricane of history, as I've been calling it, bring all of this destruction before easing into a relative calm, something like the eye of a storm with its light winds and clear skies. But this will not last for very long. At the end of the last episode, we left the story in the wake of King Norodom Sihanouk's self-proclaimed Royal Crusade for Independence. And although this mission he embarked upon was helped by a few outside factors lining up and falling into place nicely for him, all in all, it had been a stunning success. The king, who had been put on the throne as a 19-year-old, because the French thought he would make a pliable asset for continuing their empire in Asia, well, instead, he had proved to be one of the decisive factors in their loss of this particular jewel in their crown. The king had basically needed to shut down the regular Cambodian political process in order to achieve his aims. He had become increasingly suspicious of the parliament and its Democrat majority, assuming there may have been some plot to remove the monarchy and to join forces with someone like Son Ngoc-Tan, who was now openly opposing him from the jungles in the northwest. But by hook or by crook, the king, who possessed the genius of a madman, as one prominent French official had said, was able to claim independence. Something that the Democrats, the Son Ngoc-Tans of the world, the Issarak, or the Communists had not been able to do. However, Sihanouk had fought for, and won, independence via fairly authoritarian measures. And its success meant that the king hadn't seen much evidence that this style of rule wouldn't be worth continuing. And we will see the results of that toward the end of the episode. But for now, just because the French had caved in and given Cambodia independence that didn't mean that the war, which had engulfed Indochina for the last 8 years, was over. As we saw, even Sihanouk himself embarked on some quote-unquote military operations against the Viet Minh out near Battambang. Apart from getting some pretty nice photos of him leading some men on horseback, very far away from any genuine risk, it also prompted the Viet Minh and their Cambodian supporters to put more military pressure onto the newly independent kingdom and its weary French Union army still stationed there. Beginning in the first few months of 1954, the French Union Army and the Royal Khmer Army start to come under attack in multiple areas around the country. In fact, French intelligence reports were indicating that the Vietnamese general, Vo Nguyen Giap, had begun amassing a very large contingent of troops on the border, that they were going to be used in a general offensive across Cambodia. An action like that would have had serious consequences for the newly independent kingdom, perhaps mirroring what had already occurred in Laos about a year earlier, when the Viet Minh and the Pathet Lao had carved out an area of the country and secured it under communist rule, what was called their defined liberated zone. This will end up being very important during the peace talks at the end of the war, but for now, it is probably just worth reiterating that even though the Khmer Viet Minh, who are kind of at the head of the United Israq Front, were controlling about 1/3 of Cambodia's countryside, and perhaps up to 1 million Cambodians. But they had not been able to achieve the same extent of a liberated zone. There was no clearly defined area of the country that was simply theirs. Like, if you think about a house, and you drew a line right down the middle and said, okay, this side is mine and that side is yours. Communists living on one side, government on the other. Instead, Cambodia resembled a house where someone was claiming 25% of the kitchen, 60% of the basement, 10% of the lounge room, and on weekends it had 30% of the backyard. Sure, there were places that the French Union Army considered no-go zones. In fact, Salot Sa has been living in one on the border with Vietnam for almost a year at this point. But it's all still unofficial. But perhaps this general Viet Minh offensive was going to change all of that. By May of 1954, it seemed that if it had occurred, it would have been disastrous. A weekly French intelligence summary of its own forces and the Royal Khmer Army was not painting an optimistic picture. It reports whole units in mutiny, regular Cambodian forces disintegrating, and that a general offensive would cause scenes of indescribable panic and carry the most serious consequences. Basically saying, look, if there was a big attack on the highway into Phnom Penh, we don't know if we could have anyone capable of stopping them. But as the days and weeks go by, this offensive never comes. Why? What was stopping the Viet Minh? Was it a supply issue? Logistics? Did they not have the confidence? All they had to do was go that extra mile, and they would have had a huge area of Cambodia well and truly in the hands of the communists. Make a great bargaining chip for any upcoming peace talks. Well, there are a few reasons why they stopped short. The first comes down to tactics and strategy. Turns out that the attacks that had occurred across Cambodia, in the northwest, the southeast, the north, as much as they might have been causing general disarray for the Khmer Royal Army and the French Union, they had in fact been only diversions. Those of you listening with the timeline of the French Indochina War already in your mind will have already clocked onto the fact that by May of 1954, a little-known battle in the valley of Dien Bien Phu was actually almost at an end. But that isn't the only reason they stopped. Diversions or not, they had their enemy up against the ropes. What harm could a little extra territory for the Cambodian communists to call their own do? Well, not for the first or last time in this story, events elsewhere and the actions of other, bigger countries was going to seriously alter the course of Cambodian history. The delicate dance of international relations is going on in the background, and a leash around the neck of the Viet Minh's military, economic, and national interest is being pulled back, for reasons we will soon discover. But for now, we will look at the results on the battlefield itself. We've been waiting to talk about it for months now, the climax of the First Indochina War. It's time to shift our attention fully to what is going on in Vietnam and the battlefield of Dien Bien Phu, as this is where the events occur that will impact the Cambodian side of the story for years to come. Many of you listening will know all about Dien Bien Phu. It is one of the most famous battles of modern history. It's taught in some high school curriculums. That's where I first learned about it. And it has a place in the imaginary, casual military historian's handbook of things to talk about. I'm also aware that many of you listening might know exactly nothing about Dien Bien Phu, and might have been wondering what I've been referring to numerous times over the last few episodes. So that puts me in an interesting position to try and explain it. I don't want to bore those that are familiar, and I don't want to skip over it or presume too much and leave others in the dark. What I'm going to do is try and look at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, less in the way that a military history show might. I don't claim to know all the nuts and bolts and who shot what and where and when. I want to look at this more through the lens of human experience, particularly the Vietnamese experience of the battle. I want to challenge some of the general views of what happened and place it within the full context of what is going on in the background. Yes, the military dimensions, we will get to that, but also the international relations that will have a massive impact on the battle and are somewhat more relevant to the Cambodian side of the story that we want to be focusing on eventually. So, a little bit of background first. I think the most important aspect is the length of time the war has been going on for at this point. 8 years is a long time. A long time to be fighting a war if you are France, coming off of the back of the Second World War, and trying to maintain an army and an empire half a world away. And it is a long time to be fighting this bigger and better equipped army if you are the Viet Minh. After all, the state declared by Ho Chi Minh in 1945, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, this was a state trying to establish itself in patches across South, Central, and Northern Vietnam, trying to keep up a fight that began, for them, as a guerrilla war, but with the backing of the Soviet Union and the new People's Republic of China, well, it had turned into something a bit more conventional. That is tough, especially since on the other side of the ring, you've got the United States making it a foreign policy goal, or even more of that, a kind of mission to contain the spread of communism that they see coming down from China and into the rest of the region. So they are pouring money and materiel into the French war effort. Back in France, however, there is a serious lack of popular support for this war. La Sale Guerre, the Dirty War, as it had begun to be known. The French are also choosing a direction to take in this new Cold War world. Do they strengthen their commitment to a position in Europe? Or do they continue sinking money into their empire in Asia that, A, doesn't seem like the native people there really want you, and B, classic colonialism generally doesn't seem to be the done thing anymore? This new game seems a lot more like pick a side between the US and the Soviet Union, start making defense and economic treaties with other countries on your side, and for a country like France, it's probably better to focus on the defense of France than the jewels in their colonial crown. That being said, it is common for proud people to not just pack up their things, call it a day, and go home when people ask you to. You've got some pride on the line here. As the French put it, an honourable end to the conflict had to be found. Now, to all of that context, also add a couple of extra dollops of even wider international context. Number 1, the war in Indochina is not the only Cold War proxy involving the US, Soviets and China. There's another one going on, about 2,000 miles away in Korea. Number 2, you know who died on the 5th of March, 1953? Stalin. All the big states involved in this ramping up of tensions since the end of the Second World War were kind of looking for a bit of a break. And perhaps there was a gap opening up for everyone to just cool their jets a little bit now that the Man of Steel was out of the picture. We will refer back to these international circumstances more in just a moment, but let's look back to Vietnam and how France are looking to achieve their honourable end to their dirty war. I don't want to lean too heavily on this football analogy, which I'm pretty sure alienates plenty of my listeners in the US and anyone else who isn't a fan, but I do find French plans to achieve their honourable end to the war fairly similar to a kind of managerial change at a football club. The owners, the people in charge of the money, etc., they are the French government, whilst the manager in this instance is going to be the man they hire to find the solutions they need on the pitch. Without getting too niche with the references here, they go for an old guard kind of manager, a veteran of the First and Second World Wars, General Henri Navarre, who is named Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces in Indochina in May 1953. This is the appointment a team needs when they're looking like they might fall into the relegation zone. They need a pick-me-up. They're not going to start playing, fancy footwork football. They aren't aiming to go on and win the title, but they have to avoid the drop. He also has next to no money given to him to spend, so he can't just buy a new team. He's dealing with what he's got on the ground. The remit he is given by the government is to create the necessary military conditions on the battlefield so that diplomats could reach a favourable solution at the negotiating table. Navarre devises a plan to accommodate his government's wishes. He can't rely on a massive influx of new troops, so the first part of his plan is to avoid any large battles for a year or so, taking the time to rebuild the French Union forces. Then, in 1954 and 1955, he will stage a decisive military blow to the Viet Minh and force General Giap to the negotiating table on terms that suit France. Job done, 11th place, staying in the Premier League. At the outset, neither Navarre or Giap are planning on staging a large battle at the Dien Bien Phu Valley, which is in the northwest of Vietnam. However, Viet Minh military intelligence was able to quite quickly figure out Navarre's plan that he had concocted and was going to be implemented over the next couple of years. And Giap began staging military actions across Indochina as a means of diverting and stretching out the French Union Army. The French, in the meantime, began to think that a large-scale military action may have been planned for Laos. And as the Dien Bien Phu Valley sat on one of the main routes from North Vietnam to Laos, it was chosen as the location of an entrenched camp that could withstand and repel a large Viet Minh assault, even though this valley sat in the middle of a region which was not under French Union control. But the French figured that, with their superior air power, they can just, fly over the top of the area that is not under their control and drop their forces into this valley, clear it out, no problem. In November of 1953, the French parachute 6 battalions into Dien Bien Phu, equipped with the means of creating this fortified camp around an airstrip that would then be able to supply more than 15,000 troops. Eventually, 12 battalions and more than 13,000 French Union troops would be stationed there. Morale ran high, as it was assumed that this well-armed and well-supplied contingent would be able to suck Giap's forces in and casser du Viet, break the Vietnamese. Now, it should be pointed out that at this juncture, in late 1953, it was still not the expectation of Navarre that Dien Bien Phu was going to be the kind of large-scale, decisive battle, the one he was saving up for and planning for that would force Giap to the negotiating table. Ideally, all of that was going to happen later. This was still the stage where he was supposed to be consolidating his forces. Dien Bien Phu had simply began as an entrenched camp capable of fending off what they thought was going to be this large incursion into Laos, as well as readily destroy them if need be. The French garrison there was not intended to be fortified to the extent that it should have been if it were to be the location of the last major battle in the French Indochina War. But it is. Navarre still thinks that there are 10 more games left in the season. Testament to this is the fact that he still orders another offensive in central Vietnam on the 13th of December, with military strength far higher than what was stationed at Dien Bien Phu. But on the other side of the equation, Giap knew that Navarre had committed a significant enough amount of his army in that one valley that if it could be wiped out, it would represent an opportunity to do exactly what the French had hoped to do to the Viet Minh. Casser du Français. Break the French. And there is another circumstance here that is going to hit Navarre and the French really hard. It turns out that the peace talks weren't going to happen a year or two from now. The international pressure coming from some of the big powers that were funding this war, well, it's turning things into a diplomatic solution being the far more likely outcome quite quickly. And guess what? The talks were going to start in just a few short months. Basically, the regular season has been called off. There aren't 10 games left. Nope. Now the next game is going to be the decider. It's turned from league season into cup final. Dien Bien Phu, whether Navarre liked it or not, was going to be the battle that would determine the French military negotiating position. Something that it was just not designed for. By the time they realized they were surrounded by more than 45,000 Viet Minh, it was too late to get out and too late to improve the camp's deficient fortifications. By the end of December 1953, the Vietnamese Politburo had issued orders to surround the garrison of Dien Bien Phu and wipe it out completely. But at the same time, continue campaigns across Indochina to keep the French Union spread thin enough to ensure that this main battle would be decisive. This ties into what we talked about earlier with the Khmer Royal Army and the French Union fighting those battles across Cambodia into the first quarter of 1954. But the task ahead of the Viet Minh at Dien Bien Phu was not an easy one. It required massive mobilization of forces and the help of hundreds of thousands of peasants in order to transport rice, weapons, and artillery into the hills surrounding the French camp. The Viet Minh had to dig deep into their population and their army in order to pull this off. And it will be a result which will end up one of the most powerful and enduring myths that the Vietnamese regime still holds onto, a kind of sacred resistance. In researching this episode, I came across a 2010 article that Christopher Goscha wrote in the European Journal of East Asian Studies, titled Hell in a Very Small Place: Cold War and Decolonization in the Assault on the Vietnamese Body at Dien Bien Phu. In this article, Goscha states that he wants to, quote, factor back into this picture the human suffering, fear, and corporal destruction that went into this battle, part of modern Vietnam and its history. End quote. One of the interesting takeaways from this article was the rapid development of the Viet Minh as a conventional fighting force, and the influence that the Soviets and the Chinese had here, not just in the conventional sense, like the transformation of low-intensity guerrilla warfare tactics through to the training, armament, and equipping of 6 divisions by the end of the war, like going from no tanks to tanks. But it's not just tanks, it also relates to aspects of conventional warfare like medicinal goods and training. I'm sure many of us kind of have this impression of the Europeans coming to fight in these exotic locations and being ravaged by the diseases that the locals could just shrug off. But as Goscha says, quote, disease and sickness were deadly adversaries for any army deployed in the tropics. Cholera, malaria, dysentery, typhoid, these could be as lethal as flying bullets and artillery fire. And the Vietnamese soldier's body was no more immune to tropical diseases than the colonial one. End quote. It's not just the logistics and equipment and training for the Viet Minh that came from this internationalization of the conflict, but also the medicine that was able to keep them in the fight. He goes on to say, quote, by the early 1950s, the Vietnamese war state had fielded an increasingly healthy army in central and northern Vietnam, capable of fighting set-piece battles against the better inoculated colonial one. The irony, of course, was that those same increasingly healthy young bodies were now going to be thrown against some of the most modern killing machines of the 20th century. End quote. The strides that this fledgling state and its army had taken in order to get to this point where they can genuinely challenge the French at this garrison are really quite staggering, and testament to the power of the political energy that's been used to sustain this effort, namely nationalism, patriotism, and communism. Now, it is probably worth setting up the actual scene of Dien Bien Phu briefly. The setting, the location. We've mentioned so far that it's a valley. So it's a valley that the French have dropped their forces into from the air. And they've done so with enough resources and material to build an airstrip, and then using that airstrip they can further fortify the base. Now, in all of that, there's no trucks. The French can't get trucks there, just airplanes. Bear that in mind. This is an essential feature. It's a low, flat area that they're building this base on, and it's surrounded by elevated hills and cliffs covered in rough, fairly densely forested terrain, and it's a stark image. If you look at it on Google Maps today, you can just see this oval-shaped area about 20 kilometers from top to bottom and about 3 kilometers wide, or about 12 miles long and 2 miles wide for my North American friends. I'll leave the link to Dien Bien Phu in Google Maps just in the show notes, so you can just quickly go and have a look, because when you look at it and see, you're just like, wow, okay, so this area was in the middle of a Viet Minh zone and you've decided to set up an airstrip and your camp in the middle of this enclosed valley. Okay. Well, at the time, for Navarre and the French, these hills surrounding the area, for them it looks more like protection than a potential hazard. But for those of you who know how the story goes, that's not quite how it works out. As we said, the Viet Minh are able to pull the levers of mobilization in the surrounding areas and villages and call on more than 250,000 civilian porters to carry the necessary equipment, food, ammunition, hardware, as well as the artillery, machine guns, grenades, anti-aircraft placements. A lot of this is big, heavy stuff. Cumbersome. Anyone who has ever had to try and recover a bogged vehicle out of a muddy, wet hole in the ground will probably have experienced some minuscule percentile of the effort, commitment, and pain in the arse that would have been to bring these massive amounts of iron up these hills. And this is a famous thing too, the idea of breaking these heavy artillery up, camouflaging themselves and the parts, and then relying on masses of humans to haul them through these tracks up into the hills, looking over the valley and the French camp. The French had this idea that over that kind of terrain, there was simply no way that the Viet Minh could get more than a handful of the kind of artillery up there that would actually be able to A, hit them, and B, do any meaningful damage, even if they did. But, unfortunately for the French, the Viet Minh get loads of big, heavy, far-shooting artillery and anti-aircraft guns, and hospitals, and more than 4,000 tons of rice up there. Enough to support the more than 45,000 troops in those hills. What's that movie, The Hills Have Eyes? Well, in this case, the hills have guns. Big ones. This has taken a toll on the DRV, though. In some areas, the steep amount of rice that had begun to be requisitioned from the population was potentially going to cause a food crisis. Like in this instance, where they are bringing up 4,200 tons of rice for this battle. Do you know how much rice that is? That's like 120 big old semi-trailers full of rice for just this one battle. For a state that doesn't even really have borders and has been at war for 8 years. Alec Holcomb wrote that, quote, "The steady spread of the food crisis had a terrible logic to it that must have weighed on the party leaders. With every harvest, rice collection became more imperative and more difficult as the amount needed to feed the army, bureaucracy, and now increasingly areas that were suffering from famine. That became a larger portion of a shrinking pie. Eventually a tipping point would be reached when the collection of rice from villages would start to condemn a certain percentage of the community to severe malnutrition or even death, taking more people out of the workforce, resulting in yet more land left fallow, further decreases in production, worse famine, and so on. At that point, no matter how skilled, brave, and well-equipped the army was, this food crisis would overpower all other efforts. The DRV was not at that point at the start of 1954, but its leaders must have recognized that they were heading there." End quote. We'll return to this point at the end of the discussion as well, like the toll that this was all taking on this state. Anyway, by early January, Navarre becomes aware that the hills are teeming with Viet Minh and artillery, and perhaps only hubris can explain why he still didn't cancel French Union campaigns in Central and South Vietnam, and do as much as possible to back up what they had committed to Dien Bien Phu. Because by now, there isn't actually a way to extricate themselves from the valley. By the very design of this base, they are literally surrounded from the outset. General Giap knows it too. So instead of starting the attack at the end of January as they had originally planned, they go that extra mile to make sure that they are going to win 100%, It's also an added benefit that the more time they wait, the more noises are being made in the international community about upcoming peace talks. So the Viet Minh are just about lining everything up in their advantage here. They are also helped by the extra support that China and the Soviets are able to give them, as the fighting of the Korean War had ended. The Chinese even send some of that rice that was needed for the battle, and the Soviets are able to hand over some Katyusha, which are these truck-mounted multiple rocket launchers, also known as Stalin organs. And the French are just sat there waiting for something to happen. And on the 13th of March, something finally does. After reading out aloud a message from Ho Chi Minh, Giap's 312th Division sung the Viet Minh anthem and began their assault on one of the outermost French posts in the valley, Beatrice. Each of the French strong points that comprised their garrison were given a feminine name, using the first 9 letters of the alphabet, from Anne-Marie to Isabelle. The French had been anxiously anticipating this kind of movement from the Viet Minh for weeks now, with only isolated actions and the occasional smattering of light artillery fire. And as the Vietnamese battalion advanced from their positions, which they had dug around Beatrice in the northeast of the valley, the French readied their weapons to counter them. And that is when the shells from Giap's artillery begin to fall. Not only does this bombardment severely hamper French efforts to forestall these, essentially human wave attacks, but the expertly aimed weaponry, carefully concealed in the hills, begins smashing the lifeline of the entire encampment, the airstrip. And from that day, the 13th of March, the scene is basically set. This is how it is going to play out. The French are cut off from supplies via land because they've set up this base in the middle of Viet Minh territory. They are under fire from heavy artillery spread around the hills of their entire camp that is extremely hard to fire back upon. The one way for them to get reinforcements is via airdrop, with each plane attempting to do so susceptible to heavy anti-aircraft fire. And each of their 9 bases spread around this valley will one by one fall to advancing waves of Viet Minh, who have utilized another important weapon in this battle, the shovel. In something that is reminiscent of the 1986 film Aliens, these French outposts are going to be surrounded by these series of trenches, and before they know it, the enemy is going to be right up onto them. When they peek through the roof and they're right there, it's basically that. The Viet Minh troops encroach, they dig in, they wait for a barrage of artillery, and then charge, rinse and repeat, leading to a bombardment the likes of which the French probably hadn't experienced since the Battle of Verdun in 1916. And that's a comparison that's made, all the time, not just in hindsight by writers and historians and amateur podcasters, but by the French officers writing in their diaries during the battle, especially once the French have to begin digging in themselves. The return to trench warfare is an interesting part of this, especially when you consider, if you're familiar with the fighting in World War I on the Western Front, the ways that the Viet Minh are experiencing this battle. They are throwing young men over the trenches here, into the machine gun and artillery fire of the French Union Army, and with a similarly ruthless disregard for their own casualties. they lose a couple of thousand men in the first few days of fighting. Going over the top, as it were, conjures up certain images in the Western consciousness about World War I, the terrible injuries caused by industrial weaponry, the gut-wrenching damage from shrapnel and so forth, particularly when many of these young men lacked helmets. It's a shockingly brutal scene. And by the end of March, torrential rains will also begin to pour in and provide further comparisons to the Western Front, the trenches filled with mud, disease, blood and gore, soldiers having to navigate around corpses to fight and defend. It also reminds us of another, more general theme of World War I, this idea of total war, and the lines between civilian and combatant. Christopher Goscha argues that, quote, "These wars of decolonization, especially those internationalized by the Cold War, would mobilize civilians and combatants alike and blur the lines between front and home in arguably more total ways than in the West during World War I." End quote. We've already seen how villages themselves would become a kind of battleground from day to night, as each fledgling state tried to establish its dominance over the Vietnamese populace. But this battle brings us that proper large-scale dependency on the use of civilians to make the Viet Minh war effort possible on this scale, the scale necessary to inflict such a devastating blow on the French, in a sense to echo the sentiment of the German Chief of Staff von Falkenhayn at Verdun. One of his aims was to bleed the French white. Well, the Viet Minh were going to bleed them into capitulation or annihilation, but the Viet Minh would not escape this bloodletting either. One difference in the trench warfare being implemented by Giap, however, was that these lines were not static and facing the opponent for miles, as they had been dug into the fields of Belgium roughly half a century earlier. No, Giap had ingeniously began digging these trenches in encroaching patterns around the entire French position, slowly closing in on outposts to be picked off next. And this is what happens over the course of the battle. A battle which lasts about 8 weeks or so, from the beginning of the Viet Minh assault, and the French are immediately mired in this miserable situation. With no way out, their morale quickly dwindles, and leadership is faced with this previously unthinkable outcome. That being said, the Viet Minh still have to go out and win this. The onus is on the 50,000 or so troops that Giap has under his control. And while the odds are against the French Union, they're no pushover. There are 3 main wave attacks that take place, and the Viet Minh will suffer a killed-in-action rate of 32% during the first wave, 25% during the second, and then 20% on the final attack. The fighting was brutal, and in another gruesome echo of the so-called Great War, full of disease and filth. As the rains didn't let up and the fighting intensified, the disease breeding in the mud amongst the corpses that remained unremoved, the stench and accompanying density of flies and maggots feasting on death and infection, all of this was something that terrified many of the young Viet Minh soldiers. Despite the best efforts of their medical officers to disinfect the battleground, eventually a dysentery epidemic will break out in their ranks. The psychological impact on their war effort here is interesting to consider, as are the effects of the trauma on their physical bodies. All of this, added to the sheer numbers of those being killed and injured, was enough to shake the resolve of some of the troops and officers expected to continue to carry out these actions. A test of the communist and nationalist energy we've spoke about so often in the series. And this is the aspect that I feel isn't quite touched upon enough in the story of the great victory of the Viet Minh at Dien Bien Phu, and something that Goscha really goes into in that journal article, so I'm going to quote a bit more to you to get that across. Here it is. Not everyone could take it. Of the lightly wounded at Dien Bien Phu, around 5,000 men, internal sources confirm that many, apparently too many, did not want to return to combat after surviving the first and especially the second assault on the entrenched French camp. Many men could not overcome all the physical and psychological difficulties they had encountered in a few crowded hours. Others were exhausted from the fighting and the endless digging to extend the trenches forward, often under enemy fire. But the General Staff needed the lightly wounded back in action as quickly as possible, especially with the prospect of negotiations at Geneva on the horizon. A special political commissar for the front lines medical units attended to what had clearly become a very serious problem during the battle. As one official history put it, of the greatest importance was political work among the wounded, especially the lightly wounded. End quote. Now, what Goscha is pointing out here are a few of the cracks in the so-called sacred sacrifice myth of the battle. The idea that you might have even picked up through general societal osmosis that what happened at Dien Bien Phu was this complete disintegration of the French, probably accompanied by some stereotype about the French army, and the Vietnamese obliterated them due to their complete fearlessness and solidarity with their movement. But it wasn't so easy. It wasn't as pure as party history would like it to be remembered as. It was gritty and costly. There was a real problem that the Viet Minh faced in keeping up the ideological fervour required to do something so dangerous and difficult. As the battle raged on through April, Vietnamese party documents reveal that morale was eroding. Troops and even officers began to refuse orders to go over the top and attack in waves. This was seen in Vietnamese communist terms as, quote, manifestations of passive rightist deviationist thinking, which is the kind of language we will get used to throughout the series. It's quite remarkable. And on this troubling development and threat to their victory, the Viet Minh general himself said, quote, all the necessary conditions are there for us to win. However, there is still one great threat. One extremely dangerous threat to our ability to carry out that task. That threat is rightist, deviationist, and passive thinking that has seriously and insidiously infested the ranks of our cadre and executive committees within the party apparatus at Dien Bien Phu. If we do not wipe out this rightist and passive deviationist thinking, then it will be extremely difficult for us to carry out our glorious victory. End quote. Well, how does one go about trying to fix this? Well, these rightist tendencies, rather than simply being the result of post-traumatic stress or not wanting to die, these ideological fallibilities would be fixed by dozens of political cadre being dispatched to the field hospitals and areas with those recovering from the battle. Study sessions, propaganda, what we might call attempts to re-inject some of that communist energy back into the bodies of these boys who didn't want to, in their eyes, senselessly die in another human wave attack. For those that refused, there were consequences, including execution for cowardice or insubordination. Now, naturally, this is also occurring on the French side of the equation as well. In quite large numbers in some cases, there's this whole rats of Dien Bien Phu thing that goes on. But the reason I'm more looking at this Viet Minh side is twofold. First, because it scratches away some of the Vietnamese Communist Party's myth of the battle, which I also think has been, echoed in what we could probably term the memes about the Battle of Dien Bien Phu that are present in Western thinking about it. They really suffered quite greatly here, and many more Viet Minh will die than French forces in the battle, even though they will achieve their victory. Both sides were exhausted, and that exhaustion will be relevant to the terms of peace that are also on the horizon. But the other reason I wanted to touch on this particular development, particularly on this side of it, is the language itself. Like how that political energy is articulated with this jargon. And it's something we're going to see again and again in Khmer Rouge ideological discourse as well, particularly when it comes to the framing of who or who is not a counter-revolutionary or an enemy of the party. I'll quote Giap again in this battle to get across what I mean. So here is he, again, talking about this negative, rightist, deviationist thinking in some of his troops and officers. Quote, "They do not want to find out the enemy's actual situation, for fear that it would uncover difficulties that needed to be resolved. They fear having to fight bravely in difficult conditions. They want to score easy victories, and as a result, they frequently fail. They are not absolutely revolutionary. Our revolutionary responsibility is to fight to the end in order to secure independence for our people, peace for the world, and to implement communism." End quote. Now, those are some fairly lofty ambitions, but what I think is really interesting there is just how those ideas are conveyed through the language, how these motivations, in this case in communist terms, are expressed. Whether it's the need to motivate a township into some collectivized agricultural unit, or a new massive communal labour project. Or here at Dien Bien Phu to jump over the top of a trench and face machine gun fire without a helmet on. Or later, we will see how it is used to arrest, imprison, and torture someone who has been accused of not having the right revolutionary consciousness. All of those activities require human energy to carry out, and that energy needs to be conjured in different ways, whether through political jargon like this, or fear, or coming out of the bonds that form between people when they're in groups. And this doesn't have to be a left-right thing, or even a political thing. We use this kind of language in sports, or to try and get someone to do a good job at work. There is always a rock that needs pushing up a hill in some form or another. And the ways that we have to convince ourselves and others to do it are kind of fascinating sometimes. But yeah, before I get accused of the kind of deviationist thinking that deviates us right off topic, let's continue with the story at hand, to the battle itself. As I said, it covers about an 8-week period of misery, really, for both sides, I think it's safe to say. But for one, where a victory is in sight. It lasts from early-ish March 1954 to early May. Giap takes his time with each action, slowly taking these outposts, Dominique, Elaine, Eugette, Isabelle, as the French hold on for dear life. Now, Dien Bien Phu, as we spoke about earlier, it is already a known quantity at the beginning of the battle that the significance it is going to have in terms of the upcoming peace talks. So while it's going on, there are some developments that really bring the international scene into the picture. And the role of the US in the battle, as it's already been financing the French war effort for many years now, it's worth looking at that before we get to the final stages of the battle, and then the outcomes. We've outlined the basics of how Dien Bien Phu plays out. The French in the valley, the Viet Minh in the hills surrounding it, and the inability of the French to really be able to offensively end the Viet Minh's assaults. They can defend, sure, that's what they'll do, but they can't manage something that will break back and end this. But maybe there was someone else that could do that. Certain US officials are looking at this battle very closely. It would be an oversimplification to say it was, all the hawks in Washington looking to have a good fight, but there were those that wanted exactly that, to give some commies a good punch on the nose. What was being proposed in some circles, and some circles that overlapped with those high up in the Eisenhower administration, of course, was something called Operation Vulture, a plan that would have seen a massive B-52 bombardment of those hills around the valley. A plan that even had casual mentions. I'd say it probably gets overstated that, this was anything more than just spitballing. But there was mention of using 3 tactical nuclear bombs and, saving the day. Now, the reason that does get a mention whenever this part of the battle comes up, even if it was in a hey, I'm just throwing this out here as an idea in a team meeting kind of thing, it's that using nukes at Dien Bien Phu would have been absolutely huge. First and foremost because it strikes right at the heart of what we called in the last episode great state autism. This idea where it's hard for these hegemonic world powers to really judge a situation and understand the mind of these smaller countries in it. In this case, the wishes of the Vietnamese people to have some kind of autonomy or independence from French colonialism. That wish, it could have been stomped out through lending the French a few atomic weapons, which is just a wild part of that plan. But it's a little taste of what is to come next at Geneva, as well as how lightly some of the other world powers have to tread here, with some US policymakers so hardline in their stance against the perceived encroachment of communism that any big move either way would have brought the US in guns blazing. At Dien Bien Phu, however, the US eventually refused to commit to Operation Vulture, or to even just putting their own troops on the ground to support the French. They want to avoid another Korea. The cogent argument that's going around from some in Washington is that this would have been the wrong war, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. As the peace talks approach, however, some US officials were looking around at other countries to try and organise some bilateral action that would have given them the pretense of international support to get in and do some fighting. But these attempts, particularly with Britain, don't find any support. This meant, for Dien Bien Phu at least, that the battle would end without the radical entrance of death from above at the hands of the US. If France had already been in the process of handing over this baton of war in Indochina to the US, well, there was a period here where Washington really looked ready to take it from them and start running. But for the moment, it stays more or less between the two of them, and the battle itself draws out to its inevitable conclusion. The tactics of the Viet Minh, with their Chinese military strategists' help, they keep digging up to the last remaining French outposts on the floor of the valley. And by May 7th, with all of the invited parties already in Geneva and discussing the wars in Asia, Jap's slow strangulation of the enemy unfolds, with a final, all-out attack mustered by some 25,000 troops. They storm the entire encampment, and amongst the smouldering debris and carnage, the French forces finally capitulate. Word of the Viet Minh victory at Dien Bien Phu, one of the most important battles of the 20th century, reached Paris by 5 o'clock that afternoon, the day before the talks at Geneva were to begin specifically discussing the war in Indochina. Their historic victory, at great human cost, this sacred sacrifice as they would call it, was about to have its effect on the world stage. And one might think that, given that they had broke the French, that the French now had no will to keep fighting this dirty war, well, wouldn't the Viet Minh get what they want? Get Vietnam? Potentially even secure massive parts of Indochina? With those that would be friendly to their movement? Well, not quite. For all of their fighting, the Viet Minh will leave this peace conference with just half a country. And the reasons why are going to have long-lasting effects on our story. let's set the stage for what is going to happen at Geneva, because there are about 5 or 6 spinning plates here that I want you to have in mind as we go through it. First things first, I feel the timing of it can be often relayed in a way that confuses the significance of Dien Bien Phu. Remember, the war is not over. The Viet Minh had just perfectly timed their assault on the French base so that this stunning battle would be won just as the talks about what was going on in Vietnam began. The talks are not a result of Dien Bien Phu, but the result of the battle will influence the talks. As we mentioned with Cambodia at the start of the episode, there is fighting going on all over Indochina, and it will continue throughout the peace conference, which itself lasts for about 3 months. It wasn't like the French lost at Dien Bien Phu and therefore lost the war, and then a conference was called afterwards to discuss what to do. They are overlapping to a large extent. It's just that the Democratic Republic of Vietnam played that particular hand of cards perfectly and can walk into the conference with some swagger. But as we said, that impression that France lost so the Viet Minh won doesn't really translate through to the deals that are made at Geneva, and the reasons why will have ramifications. And to illustrate this, I used to watch a lot of cooking shows a few years ago, and the Geneva Conference of 1954 kind of reminds me of this situation you would see all the time, where a contestant would be so confident they've, got all the ingredients, the method, they've made the dish 100 times. It should be perfect. But at the end of the show, they place this food in front of the judges, and I always remember this one judge would always say this if it was a bit crap. He'd say in a French accent, "I can see a lot of stress on this plate." And when you look at the results of Geneva, it just strikes me in the same way. Like, the ingredients were there, but the result didn't come out in a way that is going to truly satisfy anyone. So what happened in the kitchen? Well, surprise, surprise, there are a lot of competing agendas that will convene at Geneva. That would make sense. It's a conference called by those interested powers in the international community that are specifically interested in resolving 2 long wars in Asia that many of them are actively involved in or financing in some way. International relations is an agenda-heavy environment. As we've said, the deck had been shuffled slightly in the upper echelons of the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin, and a new leadership was looking for some détente internationally, so that they might be able to focus on internal economic matters at home. The Chinese were in a similar position. Remember, the PRC was only declared 5 years earlier, and they had been involved in the Korean War, and now the one in Indochina as well. There was hope that the fighting in Indochina could find a similar resolution to that of Korea, with a cessation of hostilities and the division of the country until a peaceful resolution to the conflict could be found. And again, you might be asking yourself, didn't the Viet Minh just, win? Aren't they in control of, most of Indochina? Shouldn't they just get to dictate the terms of peace? Well, not quite. The Viet Minh might have a mean face on, and they have landed a huge hit in the last round of fighting, but they know they can't actually jump up and, keep going for another few rounds. And if they did, well, there's a very strong chance that a new, even bigger, tougher contestant is going to jump into the ring and pick up where the French left off. The United States are hovering over this situation in a very menacing way for basically everyone concerned, even some of their allies. 6 months earlier, the Vietnamese Politburo had begun to come around to the idea of ending the war through peaceful negotiations as well, which is why they had poured so much effort into Dien Bien Phu in the first place. So, in September of 1953, the Soviets had taken the lead and contacted France, the UK and the US, proposing some kind of international forum to resolve these conflicts. The Soviets also said that the conference had to include China, as they were a benefactor in both wars, which results in the kind of international relations equivalent of picking which friends are going to come to your 10th birthday party and sit next to each other. Because the US was so staunchly opposed to a Chinese presence at this kind of event. US foreign policy at this point was kind of pretending that the People's Republic of China just kind of didn't exist, still quite sore at the outcome of the Civil War in that part of the world. Many US policymakers still bemoaned the fact that they had lost China. So initially, the US, very much still in containment mode, have this worry that the communists are going to try and win at the table of diplomacy what they hadn't quite managed to win on the battlefield. They project a kind of, I'm not coming if they're coming energy. A little agitated, they had their reasons. Eventually, a concession is made where the powers that be decide that you can have a kind of +1 scenario. So the Soviets end up bringing the People's Republic of China, and the US gets to save face because the Chinese weren't officially invited. So who is coming? Well, you've got the 4 powers plus China. So France, UK, US, USSR, and they're +1. You've also got the main Indo-Chinese parties concerned, the Associated States of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, as well as Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam, but not the Pathet Lao, or, as I alluded to earlier, the United Issarak Front, which, remember, basically is the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party, or the Khmer Viet Minh if that's easier. They are not officially at the table. They've got a couple of representatives that are part of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's contingent of diplomats, I guess we could say, but they're not at the table. More on that in a moment. As we said, Dien Bien Phu is over the day before the conference was due to start talking about Indochina, which is some way to kick off proceedings. Now, the first week or so of the conference, that's the conference as it relates to the Indochina question, is quite interesting. It starts off with the delegate for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam spending almost all of his initial speech calling for the inclusion of the so-called ghost governments at the negotiating table, meaning the Pathet Lao and the Khmer Viet Minh. Now, Cambodia's fate is not very high on the agenda at this conference, but the insistence at this early stage from the communist Vietnamese to include their Laotian and Khmer comrades at the table is worth noting. Basically, everyone present at this negotiation is aware of the situation on the ground. They know the relative strength of the Viet Minh position. They know that there are almost 1 million Cambodians living under the communists. It would make sense that if there was a settlement, that it would need to include these parties as well. It also hints at the early Vietnamese ambition to have a kind of federation of states under communist rule. The Soviet delegate is similarly supportive when he gets up to speak, as you'd expect. But when it comes time for the Chinese representative, Zhou Enlai, to speak, he is far less enthusiastic about these inclusive propositions that the Vietnamese and Soviets have made. He somewhat carefully and purposefully notes in his opening remarks that the conference, on procedural grounds, should have the ability to determine its own composition, which is kind of like saying, I don't agree with what my comrades are asking for, but I agree with their right to ask for it, which isn't much. That is non-committal. And why is this? What about support for comrades and the communist movement? Workers of the world unite. Nothing to lose but your chains and all that stuff. Well, as I said, international relations is lousy with agendas. And if you are a subscriber to the realist view of international relations, you can look at this through the lens of the relative powers of those at the conference, and what each can do to serve its own self-interest. I'm not sure if we've discussed this idea of realism in the series so far. It's very international relations 101 kind of thing, and revolves around the idea that the system of interaction between states is anarchic, meaning there is no power above all of the states, that they are rational actors, and that they will always act in their own interest, and to maximize their own power to ensure their own survival. The Chinese position here, in relation to the Indo-Chinese question, can be explained primarily through what is best for China. And that isn't just a Chinese thing. Like I said, if you look at this through this realist lens, it is just essentially a human trait expressed in these international relations paradigms. We're going to say the same thing about the US in just a moment, or as we did earlier with their casual notion of dropping nukes on Vietnam to solve a problem for a fading French empire, which was really just about securing US interests abroad, maximizing their own power in relation to the Soviets and the Chinese. And it is that kind of, I don't think it's unfair to say, reckless, or even quite troubling potential of US power and its possible extension into Indochina that is one chief concern of the Chinese. Zhou Enlai would have no doubt been aware of some of the hints being dropped by US Secretary of State John Foster Dulles in a speech televised in America about the Geneva Conference. Dulles said that, quote, "The situation," he means the situation in Indochina, "may be perhaps clarified as a result of the Geneva Conference, but we would be greatly concerned if an armistice or ceasefire were reached at Geneva, which would provide a road to communist takeover and further aggression. If this occurs, or if hostilities continue, then the need will be even more urgent to create the conditions for united action. President Eisenhower has repeatedly emphasized that he would not take military action in Indochina without the support of Congress." End quote. A few things are not so subtly smuggled in there. For instance, if the peace that comes out of Geneva is particularly favourable to the communists, well, that's a no-no, and the US will step in. Okay, and if fighting continues, oh, you bet the US is stepping in if that happens. Well, what if the fighting were to stop, but it looked like it might happen again later, and the communists would be in a better position then? That's a step-inable offence as well. There is also the idea that's being floated here that the US will get backup if it needs to, which is a path that 21st century adventures in US foreign policy have also followed. This idea of, as long as you've got some coalition of other states, a coalition of the willing, as it was put when I was a boy. Even if the others that they rope into the war are just contributing a few blankets, as long as you can get them there on the credit somehow, then it's fine, and the US can look like it isn't acting unilaterally. All of that is fairly aggressive posturing. But what doesn't come up in the speech, but was a known quantity for those looking on at these US Cold War maneuvers, was that they wanted to set up a NATO-like system in Asia as well. And if the conference didn't proceed at a relatively quick pace, there was always the chance that they could actually do this in the background. If we were to oversimplify things slightly, much of US Cold War foreign policy revolved around these kinds of deals, grouping countries into trade deals and military alignments, with the idea being that Washington was investing in them, giving them economic opportunities, as well as military protection from this encroaching global communist threat. In return, the US is able to maintain its position of supremacy and continue this policy of containment. For China, either move by the US here isn't ideal. They definitely don't want the US setting up military bases so close to their soil, or a whole collection of states opposed to them in the region. And they will be more concerned than, say, the Soviets, because this whole thing is going on their side of the playground. They don't want the war to keep going, it's a strain on their economy. They also don't want the US to be involved in an escalated war on their doorstep. And they don't want a potential Southeast Asian treaty organization undermining their influence in the region in the future. And in a kind of interesting way, China not pushing for more communist power in Indochina is going to serve all of these aims. In the words of Ben Kiernan, who provides a play-by-play of Geneva in How Pol Pot Came to Power, he says, quote, "For Beijing, the effect of US escalation would be as damaging as that of a communist victory throughout Indochina would be limited. End quote. The other thing that might potentially concern the Chinese, if it were to occur, was that they weren't that keen on some federation of countries on their southern border there, even if they were communist. This is years before the Sino-Soviet split, which will be another huge influence on the story. But now, from a realist perspective, regardless of ideology, for them it's much better to have 3 separate nations, as opposed to one unified federation spread along one of your borders. This will be a theme we continually return to, culminating really in the Third Indochinese War. But for the time being, the diplomatic dance that Zhou Enlai does throughout this conference to avoid antagonizing the US, but in a way that gets an end to the war, but that also furthers Chinese interests, is quite remarkable, and it will go a long way in explaining the accords that are eventually settled upon. And this is the PRC's first international conference as well, so this is some debut at this venue. As a result, if the communist Vietnamese are going to have to face some concessions in order that their primary benefactors are able to get what they want on a bigger stage, well, they are going to have to concede. You can also bet that their Cambodian comrades, the little brothers in this scenario, are going to figure relatively insignificantly in their concerns as well. So, how does the conference actually play out? Well, naturally, all the actors come to this with a fairly hardline stance to begin with. There is a kind of stalemate at the outset, especially because the French can say, yeah, sure, you won that battle, but we're still in the war, which is quite easy to do with the US on their side, willing to kick things up a notch. And while the French kind of want out of this whole situation, they do want out on their terms. It ends up being the case that Zhou Enlai will kind of be given the green light by the Soviets for him to basically try and solve this prickly Asian problem. First things first, as there is still a war going on, they need to discuss an armistice. This is an early proposal by the Soviets, but things move rather slowly. Zhou Enlai, in an effort to speed things up, uses his platform at the negotiations table to state that the situation in Laos and Cambodia is different to the situation in Vietnam, which effectively closes off support for letting Ho Chi Minh's delegation speak for the rest of Western Indochina. This is designed to appease the demands of participants like the United States, who had always opposed recognition of the ghost countries that had originally been declared by the Indochinese Communist Party in the early 1950s. That was the obvious side of things. At the negotiating table, the stuff in plain sight. But it was also figured into Zhou Enlai's plans that in the background, he would start to see countries like Cambodia and Laos follow a neutral position. In this new world order, the non-aligned movement, which is beginning to get going at this point, is looking like an attractive box to put these two countries in. I'll go into what the non-aligned movement is in a moment, but essentially, his idea is that better they be neutral than aligned with the US and have US military bases on their soil, meaning China's doorstep. The Cambodian delegation as well, remember they were able to front up an official representative. They get a little plaque with, Cambodia on it, and they get to sit behind it at the table. They have official representation because of their independent status, and Sihanouk actually sent Dap Chuan in one of these representative positions. You'll remember that Dap Chuan was the former magical warlord, still controlling the area around Siem Reap like he was the governor. And I think it was actually Diamond Needle Chuan now, the latest cool name he'd adopted. Anyway, his coming along, his selection to be there, was a calculated move. Remember, this guy had previously been the head of the Issarak movement, before its shift toward the Vietnamese and communist side of the equation. Sihanouk could rely on this guy to act as this invalidation of the Viet Minh's claims that there was this massive anti-government movement in Cambodia. He could parade around these original Isarak as genuine local guerrillas that had rallied to Sihanouk's independent government. And these are much easier claims to make when the other side, the Khmer Viet Minh, don't have someone to speak. They can't raise their hand and say, "But sir." I couldn't help but think of this scenario of the Cambodian delegations at Geneva. Kind of like it's like one of them doesn't have the right paperwork. Philip Short has a take on this situation as well. He says, quote, "The Viet Minh representatives at Geneva could argue as much as they wished that Cambodia was an integral part of the Indo-Chinese battlefield, that stable resistance bases existed in a third of the country's districts, that Son Ngoc Min's ghost government had more than 800,000 Khmer. But the fact that they held no clearly defined liberated zone meant that their claims and their presence were ignored." End quote. This is what I mean. It strikes me as the equivalent of turning up to the motor vehicle department, ready to register your car, and you've got everything you need, signed all the paperwork, but you only realise once coming up to that window that you've got the wrong form. You needed Form B, whereas you've filled out Form A. And you can carry on like a pork chop and kick up a stink, but the person behind that window isn't going to register the car in your name without Form B. The Khmer Viet Minh, as they hadn't just gone far enough in carving out a clearly defined zone under their control, could not make the case that they deserved representation at the table to the same extent as Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and they don't have the ability to ask for the same kinds of things that the DRV are going to end up asking for. And to compound this problem for the Cambodian communists, if there was this concerted effort to, even at this late stage, carve out this area, this liberated zone, so they may be able to speak more freely at the conference, well, even if the Cambodian Royal Army and the French Union were not ready to fight that fight, the offensive itself would never come. It could not come. This is why the reins are pulled back by Hanoi and at the behest of the Chinese. They knew that if they did press for a more secure liberated zone in Cambodia, then this would be seen as a continuation of hostilities, and in fact, opening up a whole new front of the war. And what would happen if they did? Peace talks out the window, US jumping in, studs up. In the words of Philip Short again, quote, "Over the next few weeks, Sihanouk's representatives won back at the conference table everything that his army's incompetence had lost on the ground." Zhou Enlai, acutely aware after China's experience in Korea of the risk of being dragged into yet another war if the conference should fail. The Khmer resistance was to be sacrificed to the greater good of communism in Vietnam and Laos. End quote. Cambodia is going to emerge from this with its political and territorial integrity intact, and with a whole bunch of dissatisfied communist revolutionaries with no place to go, and perhaps a bit of a chip on their shoulder about not being treated as important enough, like some backroom deal was signed and they were left out. We will see that play out over the rest of the story as well. But for now, negotiations were going to turn toward Vietnam, and the question of partition was now becoming a necessity. As the conference moves into June, with discussions on Indochina having been going on for a month with not too much movement, a few things start to happen and act as catalysts for more things to happen. The first is on the 13th of June, around the same time that agreements are getting to the point where the DRV are going to withdraw their troops from the rest of Western Indochina. Meaning, the Viet Minh armies that are stationed in other places apart from Vietnam are going to withdraw. This is another move that signals that they are willing to let go these wider Indo-Chinese ambitions. Now, there's also a change of government in France. Pierre Mendès becomes the new French leader, and part of his election and mandate is a negotiated settlement about Indochina at Geneva. He even says he will negotiate himself if he has to. He also adds a bit of a ticking clock element to proceedings, promising to resign in 1 month's time if there was no agreement reached. But if you heard that and you're thinking, well, hold on a little bit, don't oversell it, don't show too much of your hand to the other players at the table. He also brings up the possibility of a national draft in France to bolster forces in Indochina, if need be. He also floats the trump card of bringing in the United States to a far larger extent, just so his communist opponents are also under pressure to make a deal. Basically, he's saying, if we don't wrap this game up soon, we're going to go all in. And we know that most of the people at the table don't want to go all in. So let's get serious about not doing that, okay? Now, whether this was a bluff or not, it seriously alarms the Chinese, Soviets, and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. By this point, the partition of Vietnam was now firmly on the table, as was the idea that there would be national elections, called at some point, to unify the country once again. Naturally, there's a lot of consternation about where you draw that dividing line and when you call elections. When it comes to lines, you will no doubt be familiar with this phrase, the 17th parallel. And for those of you who have forgotten their Year 8 geography class, this is referring to the 17th latitudinal line north of the equator. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam, naturally for them, they want this line to be lower, meaning the 16th or 15th parallel, meaning closer to the equator, meaning they get more territory for this northern portion of Vietnam. And this is pretty understandable as well. They've already conceded to not have the whole of Vietnam after winning such a stunning battle in the war, and now they're being forced to face the prospect of losing territories that have been firmly under their control since 1945. This becomes a sticking point, as it would, and the clock keeps on ticking. By late June, and with the prospect of an escalated, internationalized war quickly approaching on the horizon, Zhou Enlai, the mover and shaker of the conference, gets on a plane to get this deal over the line. This is like the transfer deadline day levels of negotiations. He flies back to China first to consult with his own government. Then, importantly, he travels to some regional powers in South and Southeast Asia to speak with leaders, confirming some details, and moving things into place that will allow him to get this whole Indochina-Geneva thing over the line. On the 29th of June, he reassures these regional governments about the prospect of increased spread of communist power across the mainland. In particular, by signing the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence with Indian Prime Minister Nehru in New Delhi. This was a way of signalling to the rest of Asia the prospect of a new kind of post-colonial state, a neutral state, non-communist, but non-aligned to the United States. The 5 principles, as stated in the Sino-Indian Agreement of 1954, are as follows. Mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Mutual non-aggression. Mutual non-interference in each other's affairs. Equality and mutual benefit. And peaceful coexisting. Basically, a lot of countries in the region were moving into this post-colonial phase, and were not overly keen on the prospect of another Western power simply stepping into the shoes of their previous colonial overlords. That being said, they weren't too happy to see their new independent states simply fall into the sphere of communism either. And this way, they could try and find this middle path, which suits the Chinese now as well. Like I said earlier, better to have a few neutral powers surrounding you than a bunch of US military bases. So, having taken some impetus away from the potential need for some of these countries to flock to the side of the United States for fear of the red tide flowing through China into Vietnam and the rest of Indochina and beyond, Zhou then goes to meet with Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap to organize the next step in his plan. Between the 3rd and 5th of July, Zhou Enlai is able to convince the Vietnamese leader and his general on what the final negotiating strategy at Geneva should be. Now, the big factor here that Zhou Enlai is able to use to convince them that accepting the 17th parallel will be okay, accepting the division of Vietnam, accepting the need for a non-communist political solution in Cambodia, and a simple zone of regroupment in Laos for the communist forces there, is this looming potential for US intervention. He's able to argue that this is not just possible, but likely, in the event that the Geneva Conference failed. Essentially, Zhou Enlai presents his Vietnamese comrades with a fait accompli, a done deal. This is how it's going to be, if you could just sign on the dotted line for me, please. While it is true that this pressure from the Chinese certainly had its place in forcing the North Vietnamese to the table in this manner, it was also true that they were just equally pressured by the prospect of the US continuing a war which they themselves were not in a position to keep fighting. They didn't need that much convincing of that. The Geneva Conference reconvened on the 10th of July, 5 days after this meeting between the Chinese delegate and his Vietnamese comrades. And with 10 days left before the Mendes government deadline, the final accords were about to be reached. Basically, in the words of the agreement set out on the 21st of July 1954, the Geneva Accords in relation to Vietnam provided for a provisional military demarcation line running approximately along the 17th parallel and a 3-mile demilitarized zone extending on each side of that demarcation line. French Union forces were to regroup to the south of the line and the Viet Minh to the north. There would be a period of 300 days of free movement of the populations between these two zones. Neither zone was to join any military alliance or seek military reinforcement, and an international commission, not the UN itself, was to supervise the ceasefire and the elections. In Vietnam, these elections to reunify the country would take place 2 years after the ceasefire. In Cambodia, they would occur in 1955. In Laos, a regroupment zone would be formed in the provinces bordering northern Vietnam for the communist Pathet Lao to reform and be dismantled, with the idea that both Cambodia and Laos would become neutral and independent countries with representative governments. It's also quite important to note here that the US and the Eisenhower administration did not sign these accords. In fact, they officially just noted them. They said, yep, those sure are some accords. But behind the scenes, they were already starting to move gears around to ensure that their domino theory would not come to pass. Either way, in the early hours of the 21st of July, 1954, the First Indochina War was officially at an end, with more than 500,000 military casualties shared between each side of the conflict, and hundreds of thousands of civilians. The hurricane of history had wrecked this beautiful part of the world and brought a terrible form of modern warfare. But, as you are all no doubt aware, this in some respect was just the half-time interval. Naturally, the end to war and the Geneva Accords, this is a really big deal and is going to affect all the different quadrants of our story, and both the big foreign cold winds as well as the warm, moist regional ones, if we relate this back to the historical hurricane in Indochina. As this is a Cambodian history show, I do want to get us back there and see how this plays out over the next couple of years by the end of this episode, but I do want to linger on Vietnam for a moment more and set a few things up before we leave that important part of the story. For Ho Chi Minh and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu was a glorious victory. But the war, especially the shift to conventional warfare and simultaneous social revolution, this had exhausted the people and the army, and to paraphrase the words of Christopher Goscha in his History of Vietnam, the Geneva Accords had provided for this temporary reprieve. But it's important to realize that it was specifically not supposed to result in two separate new nation-states. It wasn't a document that said, okay, good fight guys, now there's a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam, we'll see you again soon. But very quickly, the 17th parallel and the DMZ, demilitarized zone on either side, were marked with checkpoints and each side waving its national flag. Very quickly, it became a de facto border between the two areas, and they would begin organizing into separate nation-states. As the Accords stipulated a 300-day period for those in each zone to relocate to the other, from late July 1954 you have tens of thousands of French Union and Associated State of Vietnam troops, civil servants and their families, all moving to areas below the 17th parallel, and their Democratic Republic of Vietnam equivalents moving to the areas above that line, as well as any and all others who want to make similar moves. In all, you've got around 800,000 people moving to the south, and about 120,000 moving in the other direction. So almost 1 million people moving. Ho Chi Minh State was now set to take over all of North Vietnam, from the capital in Hanoi, and we will come back to how this is implemented in future episodes. Meanwhile, according to Goscha, in the south, the US was now focused on turning this area into a well-armed, anti-communist, economically vibrant, and fully decolonized nation, capable of holding the line in the struggle to contain communism. Instead of joining in the First Indochina War and escalating that war effort then and there, the Geneva Conference had allowed the US an opportunity to regroup, to prop up what the French had been unable to. The man that they would entrust to lead this new country, Ngo Dinh Diem, and his family, was also fully convinced that they alone would be able to accomplish this. We will be keeping tabs on this family in their attempts over the next few episodes as well. And if you would like to listen to an in-depth podcast series that covers this topic itself, you could listen to Inward Empire, an excellent series on the South Vietnamese leader and his family. I just want to spend a few moments wrapping up the Vietnamese side of the equation, because naturally it is going to play a huge role in the conditions that will see the Khmer Rouge come to power in a little over 20 years' time at this point in the story. And I'll quote Christopher Goscha's work again as he describes the aftermath of the First Indochina War. Quote, "The Geneva Conference of 1954 may have marked the end of French fighting, but it was potentially only a pause in two separate, though interconnected wars, a Vietnamese one and an American one. As long as both Vietnams were content to focus on consolidating their states, one in the north, the other now rebuilding in the south, then the ceasefire of 1954 could have held, and could have easily produced two separate Vietnamese nation-states today, as in the case of the two Koreas and Chinas. However, if one of the two Vietnams decided that it would renew its claim to sovereignty over or within the other's zone, then the Vietnamese Civil War would resume as one continuous conflict. The French War might have ended in July 1954, but that did not mean that the one among Vietnamese had." End quote. So there I feel he really nicely encapsulates some of the big ideas about this conflict, like the idea of the war for independence against the French versus the war between the Vietnamese themselves for who was going to control their country, which, is slightly separate from that Anglo-Eurocentric idea we often superimpose on quote-unquote Vietnam as this place that simply exists in a perpetual war against imperialism. But the Cold War was only just getting started, and Vietnam and the rest of Indochina was going to be one of the battlefields that it will drive its destruction onto. For now, we leave Vietnam bisected. The US now fully invested in entwining itself into the fate of this new southern version, and under Ngo Dinh Diem, it formally withdraws from the French Union and sheds the name Associated State of Vietnam and becomes the State of Vietnam, hereby referred to as South Vietnam, and this seems in natural opposition to its future fellow belligerent, which we can also begin simply calling North Vietnam. Next, we return to Cambodia, as a very different outcome from Geneva will take place. In those first couple of years, right after Cambodia first won its independence in late 1953, and then about half a year later its military autonomy after the ceasefire and Geneva Accords in the middle of 1954, this period becomes fundamental in determining the future shape of Cambodia's history, perhaps up until the coup that will oust Sihanouk in 1970. We're going to see how the king's power and primacy in Cambodia is confirmed. His opponents, both the ones out in the open and in the shadows, become marginalised, and the relationships that develop with some foreign countries become coloured by either warmth or suspicion, which will not see much change for decades. And on top of this, according to Milton Osbourne, brutality and intimidation would become firmly established as instruments of state policy. Well, how does all of this happen? Why are so many of these things baked in this apparently crucial time? Well, firstly, Sihanouk was euphoric about the outcome of Geneva. The Accords specifically for Cambodia are basically all to do with removing foreign military forces, including French and Vietnamese, and those associated with the Vietnamese, from the country, or just demobilizing them, meaning, the show is over. Pack it up, everyone. War's done. And because Sihanouk had managed an official independence beforehand, and as we said, there was no way for the Khmer communists to really make the case for some bit of territory to call their own, basically there was not much else of concern. No DMZ, no partition of territory. There wasn't even an area of the country marked out for the communists just to gather and regroup before going wherever they wanted to. It was stipulations of peace, of not having foreign military bases, and to have an election in a year that was just to be freely contested, and this vote would determine the political future for this now, ideally, peaceful country. We started this episode with the description of a military situation facing Cambodia that could be likened to a rather large hand slowly beginning to clench into a fist around Sihanouk's kingdom, and this fist was slapped away before it could close into something irreversibly bad for the king. It was almost as if he had emerged as a winner by default. His kingdom had been left relatively less war-ravaged than the neighbouring parts of Indochina, and the Viet Minh had been forced to freeze out their Cambodian comrades in order to gain more concessions for themselves. As 1954 drew to a close, Philip Short writes that Sihanouk found himself confronted with the perils of his own success. The Viet Minh had gone. The French protectorate was finished. Now that he had the plenitude of power, there were no excuses left. End quote. It was unknown territory, and while he has gone out and shown himself to the Cambodian people, who had, generally speaking, embraced him with a kind of enthusiasm that can really only be reserved for someone that you consider just a little short of genuinely divine. He also had the backing of a generation of senior officials who we might consider conservative. They'd also valued the royal family and its traditions, and probably their own connections to that royal family, which ensured their ongoing elitist positions. This group of people that you could probably say on the whole were probably a little bit distrustful of the potential for popular democracy to shake up the status quo. For Sihanouk, this was both exhilarating and a little daunting. He had once told a French official that getting independence all at once makes it so indigestible I may choke. It was never my intention to go this fast. While it was great to be independent, it also meant that the French army was no longer there to prop up the royal palace. Sihanouk might be really happy with the results of Geneva, but it was by no means set in stone that his primacy was inevitable, considering this looming election that was mandated by those same accords which had afforded his country's independent territory and status. How would a monarch, who outwardly praises and cherishes his country and his people, but also kind of assumes a level of childlike ignorance of politics that most of them would possess, how would someone like that approach the Western liberal democratic notion of a free election? Well, as we said, Sihanouk's attitude to this will play a fairly significant role in Cambodia's future. But before we get to that, we're going to just check in with the efforts of the Khmer communists, who were far less appreciative of the accords decided upon without their input in Geneva. If Sihanouk was really happy with how Geneva had worked out for Cambodia, well, the communists in his country were not. In the words of David Chandler in Tragedy of Cambodian History, he says that, quote, they faced the alternatives of going underground, participating in confrontational politics, expatriating themselves to Vietnam, or allying themselves with Sihanouk's feudal style of rule. Any of these moves were a betrayal of the goals they had been struggling for and postponed the real liberation of their country. End quote. As Geneva had come to a close, communist resistance fighters were left in this kind of awkward position. One of them recalled that, we had liberated 3 provinces. Why weren't we allowed to attend the conference? There was trouble among the Israqs after that. The debates lasted 7 days and 7 nights. We finally decided to destroy all our weapons so that our troops would not be able to use them to loot the goods of the people. End quote. Some of these Israq groups spent days spreading beef fat over their rifles and burying them in ways that would allow them to be dug up when needed. Others, seeing the French departure as a sign that their goals had been fulfilled, were happy enough to return to their lives as farmers in the rural areas. The Cambodian communists were, just like Sihanouk, moving into unknown territory, from armed resistance to political struggle. For those that were committed enough to the cause to keep on going, that is. But the legacy of the Israq, this wider banner that we have used to talk about anti-government organisation and administration and taking up arms, the underlying structure there, that won't be forgotten, and will come into play once again, more than a decade later, but under the Khmer Rouge. However, not everyone just went back to their day jobs. There were more than 2,000 Cambodian men and women who had joined the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party by 1954. These were not the kinds of people who simply saw the end of French rule as the end of the story. This was all part of a larger process involving people all around the world who were struggling against imperialism and capitalism, as they saw it. But the Khmer participation in that worldwide struggle was, as we saw play out at Geneva, secondary to some of their bigger brothers' immediate goals. The Viet Minh, who had provided such an important foundation for the Cambodian communists, they now suggested to their comrades to just sit tight. Some were told to stay underground in Cambodia, while many others were encouraged to come back to Hanoi with them for further training in the now solidified communist North Vietnam. However, with the elections scheduled in 1 year, there was need for another group to stay behind and organise this political struggle. In other words, to actually form a, official Communist Party, one that was going to be out in the open and contest the elections legally. So let's quickly go over, all of that, because it will remain an important theme. You've got all the Vietnamese communists leaving Cambodia. They bring with them about a third of the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party. Included in that contingent were some prominent figures like Sihanouk Min, the leader of the group, as well as some others who will play bigger roles later, such as Sao Pim and Nguyen Chea, although those two do come back to Cambodia from Vietnam fairly quickly. Another one that also stays in Hanoi for a while is Rat Sam Nguyen, the radical student who had gone to Paris with Yang Sa-ri and returned as one of the secret agents of the Cercle Marxiste. He had accompanied Salot Sa into the Marquise about a year earlier. Speaking of the men who would become Pol Pot, he takes a position within another group, those staying behind in Cambodia but in a clandestine fashion. He is going to be part of the underground, those loyal to the communist mission, but outwardly kind of a regular Joe, perhaps appealing to his secret agent kind of persona that he's been cultivating for a couple of years now, with his activities both in Paris and back in Cambodia. And the third group are those who are going to stay in Cambodia as well, but front up as this new political group who will be out in the open. This will be headed up by Kiernan, another young communist around the same age as Sa, but you'll recall from the last episode had been involved in the Cambodian communist scene for longer, and was a prominent member of the party after it was established in that initial partitioning of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party at the start of the 50s. That party will be known as the Krom Prachia Chon, the People's Group. This was separate from the quote-unquote real Cambodian Communist Party, which would remain a secret organisation, whereas this outward political group would be a kind of mask that the secret Communist Party could use in the open and contest these elections. Now, this new three-part structure to Cambodian communism from this point is, well, it's somewhat deflating from where the movement had been just a few months earlier. A large chunk of them had simply left the country for Vietnam, while the rest were either in hiding or now out in the open politically. This means that they were exposed to potential retribution from Sihanouk, even though that he was not supposed to do so. There are some who feel betrayed by the Viet Minh, cast aside. But the structure for the Cambodian communists now, they did have a rule book that was tried and tested in earlier socialist movements like in Russia, China, Vietnam. The Viet Minh version of it, which naturally they taught to their Cambodian comrades, was based upon secrecy, compartmentalization, working in enemy-occupied areas, as they use this kind of very militaristic language when talking about, being organized in your own country. Anyway, the idea was to segregate the organization into legal, semi-legal, and secret forms of action. For the group working openly, it had to be able to keep contact with those that are in secret, and for all work of the underlying party, secrecy being fundamental. The principle being that you could limit the negative consequences of a betrayal or infiltration into the party network by counter-revolutionaries. With Kiernan taking the lead in the legal side of the organization, Tu Sa Mut, one of the founders of Cambodian communism who had taken Salot Sa kind of on as an apprentice or as his assistant while working in the jungle base in eastern Cambodia, this former monk was going to take the head of the branch of the Cambodian Communist Party based in Phnom Penh. And that's going to be important as that party branch will end up being kind of the de facto leadership in the years to come, especially because the current leader, Sihanouk Min, is going to be staying in Vietnam for the next couple of decades. Salot Sa, as we've said, he was climbing the ladder and becoming a promising young revolutionary with his experiences in Paris and now in the more hands-on role in the Marquise, to somewhat assigns him to legal activities, which means he will be a secret communist, but working out in the open, but not being a representative of the Prachiachon. He was going to try and infiltrate the other big political group in the country, the Democrats, and report on them as well as try and influence their decisions. Sa is snuck back into the capital amongst all these movements of Vietnamese or communists or Cambodian communists. As we said, there is this period of movement around the whole of Indochina, basically, as a result of the Accords, and that's used as a cover to get Sa back into the capital to resume his life, but also continue his work as a secret revolutionary. And Philip Short has a brilliant example of how Sa was going to act within this new role when he goes to visit Keng Van Sa, the remarkable Cambodian student who had been a bit more established in Paris prior to Sa's own arrival. Van Sa had got Sa his apartment in Paris and had taken him under his wing to an extent, as well as been part of the Cercle Marxiste and those student study sessions. He was certainly anti-establishment, but he had not gone, we'll just say, full communist, like some of the others had. Anyway, Short describes this meeting between former mentor and protege in a way that shows us the young Pol Pot's evolving modus operandi. Quote, Sa had gone to see Van Sa shortly after returning from the Marquise. I asked him what he'd been doing, Van Sa recalled. He laughed a bit shamefacedly and said he'd been stuck with Chantarangzi the whole time. He'd never managed to get to the Viet Minh zone. Sa's story was sufficiently convincing that, years later, Van Sa continued to insist that reports of his presence among the Viet Minh must have been mistaken. People were confusing him with someone else. That part of Sa's life was now secret to all except his party colleagues. End quote. So that's where Saloth Sa is at. He's gone further down this path toward communist revolutionary. He has done his apprenticeship in the jungles, and now he is in a fairly important position within this new post-war structure that the organization was working with. And this demonstration of him lying to someone who he would have known for a few years at this point with a pretty good relationship, a former mentor, as well as someone who was at least familiar with the kinds of stuff that they'd been doing back in Paris and Cambodia. The fact that Saloth Sa is freezing out Van Sa is a testament to how far he has come. You can imagine someone less committed or perhaps less emotionally intelligent or aware letting slip a few details, which might have been something that they were secretly quite proud of. Maybe someone that was eager to impress someone, that had been a bit older than them, a bit more mature in Paris. You might have been eager to say, hey, just on the down low, I'm actually connecting with some pretty important people. I'm kind of a secret communist. And to me, this is a demonstration of a facet of Pol Pot that I think sometimes gets swept under the rug. I'll often see these takes on him as if he was a completely stupid, inept person. But I don't really think that's the case. Was he an accomplished scholar of Marxist theory? No, few are. But he definitely seems to be, I guess what you would call a people person, able to fit into all kinds of social situations with ease. Which, coupled with that famous smile that you can see in many photos of him, I think it paints this rather disconcerting picture considering the nightmare that he and his comrades will bring to Cambodia. But there is another reason why Van Sa in particular would be someone that Sa would not be exactly open with. Sa did have an ulterior motive, and that has to do with what I guess we could call this third side of Cambodian politics. We've talked about Sihanouk, the communists, but there's still the Democrats. We haven't spoken about them in a while. The old party that has demonstrated it was the most capable in the short experiment with political pluralism that the country had gone through over the last decade or so. And it was going to be going through a little bit of a renovation and reinvigoration, with the prospect of these internationally mandated elections now on the horizon. King Van Sak, the smart, anti-royalist, combative young man, was going to team up with the other elder brother of the Cambodian students back in Paris, the rich and well-connected left-wing intellectual Dien Bien had also returned from France, and together they were going to bring their own energy and dynamism to the Democrats and set about gaining its leadership and setting its agenda. So it's not going to be a huge surprise that both of these political parties, the Communists and the Democrats, are going to have a fairly similar political agenda. I mean, the new leaders of the Democrats, well, they were radical students in Paris. One of them was a member of the French Communist Party, and the other one had stopped just short of doing so. So their goals are going to overlap in fairly significant ways. And what are those? Well, basically, they contend that the Geneva Accords were the most important factor in Cambodia's newfound independence, not King Sihanouk's crusade which preceded it. They also don't want anything to do with what they perceive to be the dangers of accepting US economic or military aid, seeing the development of South Vietnam in this manner as imperialism, and naturally they are also very keen on having freely contested and impartial elections, as was supposed to be guaranteed by the Geneva Accords. And there is one more person here that needs to be mentioned when we are looking at the Cambodian political scene after Geneva. That is, of course, Son Ngoc Tan, and his Free Khmer movement that he had also taken to the jungles near Thailand, but never fully committed to the communist side of the Isarek equation. He was more hopeful about the prospect of the United States as a potential benefactor, which often proved to be incompatible with those on the left. Son Ngoc Tan tried to rally to the government in the aftermath of Geneva, an attempt which was rebuffed by the king, who by this point really hates him and still saw him as a potential threat to his power. Sihanouk refuses to even see him. Tan returns to the Thai border and becomes a kind of, I'm not sure what you'd think of it nowadays, almost like a dissident. He's given protection by the US and the Thai because of his potential use and political weight, almost like an exiled politician kind of character, with a group of loyal followers that still go under the banner of the Khmer Sarai. Tan himself will find that his own political career and potential will not produce much more, but one of his legacies will be within just Sihanouk's eyes, this politician who would undermine the authority of the monarchy and become this super popular mortal? All this praise and adoration for someone other than the true and deserving king. I think the way that he will influence the king will still remain, even if his actual actions will be less relevant from this point in the story. But even this last one, this failure to appease the king and instead becoming a kind of tool for the United States, this is going to have a big consequence in the short term, as it will drive Sihanouk, who was already fairly unimpressed by the US and their failure to accommodate his wishes for independence the year before. He will see their support for Tan as another reason to turn down the chance to become another pawn on the United States chessboard, as he saw it. Now, if we take a moment, we can see that of the kinds of political forces here, the new communist Pratyachon, as well as the regenerated Democrats, which had always commanded the majority of votes in the Cambodian political system anyway. Well, this would be further cause for annoyance for the king, who, you will recall, thinks that he basically won his country's independence by himself, and had hoped to go on and call the political shots. The prospect of a left-wing majority government coming out of these elections was deeply concerning for the king and those conservative politicians on the right. Sihanouk was not about to let that happen though, and by the end of 1954 had already begun his expert maneuvers to begin undercutting his political opponents. The left doesn't want to engage with the US? Well hey, neither do I. He begins endorsing the same 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that Zhou Enlai and Nehru had made public 6 months earlier, and signals Cambodia's commitment to neutralism. But at the same time, he gives the impression to the Western camp that one day Cambodia could be squared away within their ranks. It's classic play one off the other and reap the benefits of each, but it also makes it hard for the Democrats to really lean into their anti-American platform in a way that distinguishes what they want from what the king wants. However, as 1955 began, it seemed that the Democrats would still be able to command the majority of the vote, as things stood, that is. Sihanouk attempts to kind of remind everyone in the country about his role in gaining independence, and how was he going to do that? Well, basically he has a nationwide vote on it, a referendum. He literally puts it out there as a question, whether his royal mission to attain independence had been accomplished satisfactorily, yes or no. Unsurprisingly, it returned a result that was overwhelmingly in favour of the king's actions. 99.8%. Not bad. It was also unsurprising that it got this result when you consider some of the less than scrupulous ways in which the vote was put to the people. For instance, it is an offence in Cambodia to deface a picture of the king, so it's not exactly fair to put a picture of the king on the ballot for yes, if throwing away the yes vote could be construed as a crime you probably aren't going to do it. To go even more over the top, the yes ballot was white, and the no ballot was black, playing on traditional ideas about good and evil associated with each colour in Cambodia. There were also pamphlets dropped from planes saying, "If you love the king, choose a white ballot. If you don't love the king, the black one." So yeah, pushing the boundaries, we could call it that, on good sportsmanship on having a referendum. But this is just a taste of what's to come. Anyway, Sihanouk gets this pat on the back again, and is given what he could genuinely point to as another sign that the people agreed with him, giving him a kind of mandate about what to do next, which also involved a few changes to the constitution that he felt were part and parcel with his support for the crusade that he had initially announced 3 years ago. These proposals are a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, they envisaged extending the vote to women and giving electors the right to dismiss their representatives in Parliament. Not too shabby. On the other hand, however, they also included provisions that would have made any king of Cambodia supremely powerful over his ministers and the Parliament. The Democrats are not impressed and question the desirability of these proposed changes to the constitution. Sihanouk would later claim that the Democrats and the Communists had opposed them out of jealousy and resentment for his position. At the end of February, a democratic rally near a Buddhist wat in southern Phnom Penh was secretly attended by the king. Listening to the proceedings from a nearby villa as they were played out over loudspeaker, the king apparently began to weep with rage when he heard just how enthusiastically his political opponents were being received by the people, cheering and clapping. This spectacle that he'd overseen, well, it was an affront to his whole idea of his position. How could this be? I'll quote Milton Osbourne's biography of Sihanouk to show you what happens next. The best judgment seems to be that he was sincere in advancing his proposals and genuinely surprised at the opposition he had provoked. To that surprise was joined anger, when he realized how much of the adulation he was receiving from delegations praising the referendum result had not been genuine outpouring of popular feeling, but the carefully arranged state management of his supporters. On the other hand, he was deeply offended by the suggestion, still coming from the Democrats and others who had sympathy for Son Ngoc Tan, that the proper role of the Cambodian king was that of a constitutional monarch, without executive powers. For him, his royal crusade, success at Geneva, and the approval of the referendum all meant that the proposition that he not be in a supreme position of power, authority, and decision-making was unacceptable. It was an insult. So, in his words, he moved to drop his atomic bomb. End quote. 3 days after the terrible experience of listening to the public applaud his political opponents, on the 2nd of March 1955, Sihanouk had a sealed envelope delivered to Phnom Penh Radio. With it were instructions that it was to be opened at noon and the tape that was within it be played during the midday news. I'll read to you a portion of what the king had pre-recorded and delivered in such a dramatic fashion. Quote, "My enemies work against me ceaselessly. Some of our students who love injustice are determined to serve the Democrats and Son Ngoc Tan. The educated, the highly placed and the rich spend their time throwing up obstacles to my work for the sake of their own interests and ambitions. All this has completely discouraged me and prevents me from continuing to reign. If I remain on the throne, I will be unable to work in your interests, my poor and humble subjects. Freed from my golden cage in the royal palace, I offer my life and my strength to my people. For though I leave the throne, I shall not shirk my duty to serve." End quote. This was Sihanouk's atomic bomb. And as he put it many years later, this radio message was how the Cambodian people found out, to their great amazement, that their king had abdicated the throne. This was a stroke of political genius. He was going to become Citizen Sihanouk, and he was going into politics. He decided that his father, Suramarit, was going to take the throne in his wake, which is very handy because it means he doesn't have to worry about anyone else trying to get the throne and then use it for their own political ends. But, as Milton Osbourne says, quote, "Plain citizen Sihanouk never existed, neither in fact or in mind. There was no diminution in the respect that Sihanouk received from the bulk of the population. He still benefited from all the services that the palace could provide. His word commanded the Cambodian military. So far as status and respect were concerned, he remained king in all but name. Not only did he retain all of these advantages, Sihanouk now had a freedom of action that had eluded him before." End quote. Philip Short has a similar take. Quote, "Sihanouk could now throw himself into the political arena and fight for power like anyone else, except that, unlike his opponents, he retained what one observer called a quasi-mystical eminence that transcends politics, which made it, in this respect at least, a rather one-sided contest." End quote. Sihanouk doesn't muck around too much when it comes to entering the political scene in this new citizen outfit. 1 month after abdication, he announced the formation of the Sangkum Riastra Nium, or Sangkum for short, which means the People's Community. The name is another example of his moves to undercut his political rivals in the Communists and the Democrats, as it's kind of a homonym going on in Khmer and implies some socialist ideas. But attempts to move in on his opponent's racket didn't stop with just the name. It was described as more of a political movement than a traditional party, and it actually required any of its members to renounce their involvement with any other political party. So he was actually able to go out and poach the best politicians from other parties, force them to renounce their membership of it, and join in with the Sangkum. Most of its core from the outset were the old kind of conservative rightist elements that we've seen at a few points in the series so far, notably Lon Nol and Dap Chuan, and its aims were to, quote, "attain the aspirations of the little people, the real people, of the Kingdom of Cambodia, which we love. Our community fights against injustice, corruption, exactions, oppressions, and treason committed against our people and our country. End quote. Pretty vague there. Philip Short calls it a dog's breakfast of a political party, and that apart from loyalty to Sihanouk, it didn't really have any other clear policies. But remember, this is genius of a madman stuff. There were practical benefits of submerging party differences into a mass national political movement. If everyone is kind of on the same team, then you can get a lot done in Parliament, in the short term at least. We will see how it may have just been papering over some fairly deep cracks in the Cambodian political spectrum. But for now, and in the medium term as well, he's able to unite centrist and rightist elements, as well as many on the left of centre, into one monolithic party with a semi-divine person at its head, able to count on the vast popularity he would have with most Cambodians. He also spends this time before the elections lining up some foreign policy agenda items. For instance, Sihanouk attends a conference for African and Asian countries in Bandung, Indonesia, where he officially commits to the policy of neutralism and not to join the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. But he also signs a military agreement with the US, which a lot of critics on the left don't like. But he again has this great way of balancing that out by, he's quite out in the open, making these vaguely, sometimes not so vague, anti-US statements. This is the beginning of a policy of following an anti-American policy, but accepting American aid. Chandler considers this to be a politically astute move, giving the former king favourable publicity abroad in anti-American circles, and capitalising on the same feeling among many educated Cambodians. But at the same time, allowing the US to equip his army, this serves to balance his budget for the next 8 years. This policy of neutralism steals some thunder away from his leftist opponents, but gets him some real cash value. This is one of the best examples of having your cake and eating it too in politics that you're ever likely to see. For the United States, this doesn't make them super comfortable with the former king, and encourages their special services like the CIA to support any anti-communist Khmer that they can find. They were unable to see Sihanouk's move toward neutralism, or even anything sort of left of that, as a warranted policy. But hindsight will show us that going completely into that US camp, as South Vietnam did, will have its fair share of terrible consequences. But yes, all of this will continue to develop in our story as this hurricane gathers momentum again over the next 2 decades. But for now, with the elections just 3 months away in 1955, it was shaping up to be a very interesting vote, because the Democrats don't give up, and neither do the Communists, regardless of the pressure that they were facing from Sihanouk's Sangkum party. Thus began the Cambodian election campaign of 1955, a turning point in the history of the country. These elections were mandated by the Geneva Accords as a kind of healing process for the country, for each of the countries involved in the First Indochina War. They were to take place in Cambodia, under the supervision of an international body, but in reality they turned out to be completely ineffective as the campaign turned nasty. As David Chandler says, quote, "For the first time, the combined weight of the state's security apparatus, the royal family, and the media was mobilized in defense of a slate of candidates." End quote. Police begin putting pressure on anti-Sangkum parties, generally harassing people, banning newspapers. Often this was done to provoke a response, and then that response would trigger a trap, and that person could be sent to jail for some time. But Keng Van Sak remained vigilant as head of the Democrats. He continued making speeches, challenging Sihanouk. He attacks absolutism, underdevelopment, and exploitation. In response, Sangkum-friendly newspapers would argue against this as if it were tantamount to social unrest, relying on vague Theravada Buddhist ideas to claim that those who are poor owe their poverty to previous lives, while the rich are happy now because of their previous good deeds. Now, earlier, I mentioned that Salot Sa had been tasked with infiltrating the Democrats, and he had done so via his connection to Van Sac, playing the role of affable assistant. He would carry his former mentor's briefcase around and attend political discussions, listening, commenting now and again. It's unclear the extent to which Sa may have been able to actually influence the direction that the Democrats were going in, but it is clear that Van Sac had no idea that Sa had this ulterior motive and may have been manipulating him. Salot Sa's position within the Cambodian Communist Party was coming along nicely at this point. Unlike many of the other members who had quite rural origins, he was used to life in Phnom Penh from his time as a student. He knew the streets, as it were. He was valuable to the movement which had suffered these setbacks following Geneva. And the Prachya Chon, the public-facing political group contesting the elections, was posting up candidates around the country. However, they faced severe repression. In some provinces, its candidates were shot by unknown assailants. The Democrats, still holding in there, would soon start suffering some important losses. The first was Tion Mum, one of the left-wing brains behind the revamped party. A few weeks before the election, his mother was contacted by the Queen and told to get her son out of harm's way. In other words, something bad is going to happen to him if he stays in Cambodia. The next morning, he was bundled onto a plane for Paris. He won't come back for another 16 years. The next one to drop will be Van Sac himself. Just 3 days before the election, at a Democrat rally, a car and a bunch of Sankum supporters drive in amongst the crowd. A scuffle breaks out, and someone is shot, dead. Van Sac is blamed by the assailant as the person who hired him to kill a right-wing opponent. Van Sac is sent to jail. Later, in court, the person who made that claim retracts it. However, Van Sac remains behind bars for another 2 months without being charged. He will be released after the elections, and only after he writes a completely grovelling, apologetic letter to Sihanouk, begging for forgiveness. So 3 days before the election, and Sihanouk has done just about all he can on the intimidatory side of things, but that's just to the actual opponents. The voting itself will have similar characteristics. I've always quite enjoyed voting. In Australia, it's compulsory from the age of 18, so every few years I'll head down to the local community centre and stand in line for a bit before getting my name marked off, heading to a booth where no one can see what numbers I write with my pencil before I pop this big bit of paper into a box, head outside for a $2 sausage sandwich. It's kinda nice. There's certainly no fear, nothing you would even really consider to be pressure to vote this way or that. There are some kindly volunteers that stand near the entrance, clearly displaying what party they are representing, and if you'd like, you can take instructions from them on how to vote appropriately for the person or party you would like to vote for. I have no reason to think that anything underhanded occurs once I leave. And when I see the election results come through over the course of the evening, no matter which way I voted, I'm not inclined to think that I am being lied to or manipulated. The next day, I more or less get on with my life. The 1955 election in Cambodia. Well, it is just about as far away from that process as possible. Let's go over my voting scenario again, but this time as if I was voting under the conditions faced by many Cambodians on the 9th of June 1955. So, firstly, voting day has arrived. For argument's sake, let's say I'm living in one of the outer districts of Phnom Penh, and I'm interested in voting for the Democrats. I've only just heard that Keng Van Sac, whom I had heard speak a few months ago at a rally, well, he's been arrested after someone died at a recent Democrat event. The news I've heard wasn't quite clear on his involvement, because the newspaper I used to get had been closed down recently. But I'm still confident that the Democrats would be the best use of my vote. As I'm leaving the house, I notice my neighbour, who is a little more sympathetic to the communists than myself, and they ask when he will be going down to the polling station. He says there's no way in hell that he's going to go down, and that he would actually be scared to. I'm less worried than he is, so I get on my bicycle and I head down the street. As I approach the station, I realise that there are not many people around, but there are a lot of police and soldiers. I'm given a few ballot sheets, and upon inspecting them, I realise that the piece of paper for the Sangkum vote is so heavily printed that even when folded in half, it is immediately noticeable that it would be a vote for the former king's new party. Either way, I make my way toward the ballot urn, and I place my vote for the Democrats within it, and I put the others, including the Sangkum ballot, into the box marked for discarded votes. As I turn to leave, I notice one of the nearby officers assigned to guard the ballot urn giving a nearby group of police officers a kind of knowing glance and nod. When I was just about to pick my bike up to go home, I was hit over the head with something and given a few kicks while I tried to cover my face on the ground. The militiamen let me go on my way, and when I limp home, I do see my communist neighbour, who, while obviously concerned for me, does have just a little bit of a wry "I told you so" smile on his face. To top things off, I find out later in the evening that even though the Sangkum candidate in my area had lost, it turned out the ballot box went missing, and he was declared the winner anyway. Alright, now that was a bit of a hypothetical, I made up some of it, although I concocted it more or less based off of a few genuine recounts of what happened that day. When the results of the voting were announced, the outcome was never in doubt. In 2004, in an article for the Phnom Penh Post, Sihanouk himself recounts what happened that day. Quote, "The elections, supervised by the International Commission and held in accordance with the 1954 Geneva Agreements, resulted in the Sangkum winning all 91 seats. I had never expected a victory of such embarrassing magnitude. The Sangkum received 83% of the vote, the Democrats 13%, and the Pratyachon only 3%. End quote. This meant that not one Democrat or Communist candidate had been elected. The parliament would be entirely composed of Sangkum party members. Now, that kind of outcome, the Sangkum winning a majority, was probably going to happen anyway. I mean, they had the king on their side. Citizen Sihanouk on their side. So even without the widespread corruption, violence and electoral fraud, Sihanouk had this huge amount of supporters across the country that were basically going to vote for him anyway. But to ensure the kind of complete dominance that occurred, Sihanouk had taken measures toward that end. After all, he had appointed Diamond Needle Chuan as taking charge of security for the elections, and you kind of know what you're going to get from a guy with that name. Sihanouk would have been aware of the violence, sanctioned it even, and Chandler thinks that he would have done so partially out of this sense that he just couldn't conceive that his opponents were anything other than foolish at best, or more likely, motivated by an evil intent toward him personally at worst. If it were the latter, then they had forfeited their right to freedom, and potentially to their life. While it's impossible to know how the vote would have turned out if it had been freely conducted and counted, Sihanouk did let slip a couple of years later something that gives us a bit of an indication into what actually happened. I'll quote Philip Short's version of this. Quote, "In an incautious moment 2 years later, Sihanouk acknowledged that in fact 36 electoral districts had voted red or pink, Communist or Democrat, even though none were officially admitted to have done so. In a fair fight, the two left-wing parties might have gained enough seats to form a government, or at least the Sangkum would have had some parliamentary opposition. Instead, Cambodia became, in every material respect, a single-party state, led by a narcissistic, whimsical, charming, and utterly ruthless autocrat who was beholden to no one but himself." End quote. David Chandler, in The Tragedy of Cambodian History, has a similar take on these events. I'll quote him. A new kind of democracy had replaced the parliamentary variety that had been in place for 9 years but had not flourished, emerging from almost a century of French protection and nearly a decade of parliamentary wrangling. Most Cambodians were willing to give their agile and talented father, then only 33, the opportunity to take charge of his domain. It seemed appropriate that Sihanouk, who told them repeatedly that he had won Cambodia's independence single-handedly, should now be allowed to rule without the inconvenience of potentially hostile political parties. In October 1955, Sihanouk commanded the loyalties of most Cambodian people. A 9-year-old game was over. A new game, one that was to draw on millennia of royal authority and a new sense of public relations, had begun. End quote. For Sihanouk, remember, he later recounted this election's results as unexpected and embarrassing in their magnitude. Anyway, he had continued on a path that he had originally embarked upon in 1952, when he dismissed the parliament and started ruling by decree. This was the culmination of those early actions. He was now Citizen Sihanouk, but perhaps more powerful than he had ever been. His actions had banished any hope that the Democrats or Communists might be able to find their way to political power via the parliament. And in the wake of the blatant abuse they had suffered in the election campaign, many abandoned politics altogether, like Keng Van Sak and Tian Mum. Others simply joined the Sankum Party itself. For the Communists, they faced the political wilderness in the public, but even those in the shadows were left weakened. They were certainly in no position to revert back to an overt armed struggle, now that their political one had fizzled out, and their allies in Vietnam were now more concerned with their own domestic issues than their Cambodian comrades. In any case, Sihanouk was now totally in charge of Cambodia, and it became clear to those in North Vietnam that he would be the one that they would need to be dealing with. Sihanouk's overtures toward neutrality had also been decisive here. They realized that they would have everything to lose and nothing to gain by undermining Sihanouk's regime. He was now part of the non-aligned movement. His regime at this point looked quite non-threatening to their own. In fact, one theory goes, according to Philip Short, that the North Vietnamese had already formed a secret agreement with Sihanouk around about the same time that their Viet Minh forces were exiting the country. According to a French intelligence report from the 16th of September 1954, although not having been officially confirmed, there is this meeting between Sihanouk and a Viet Minh official, where there was to be an allowance of limited numbers of Vietnamese communists operating clandestinely in certain parts of the border regions with Vietnam. This was to allow for the struggle against South Vietnam. In return, Sihanouk had assurances that these Vietnamese communists would not interfere in Cambodia's affairs. Whether that was true or not, Philip Short notes that it was basically exactly how things played out for the next 16 years. Essentially, the card-carrying Cambodian communists are shut out of the picture. The majority of them had fled to Hanoi and were still there. Those that had tried the legal method had failed to gain any traction. Their Vietnamese allies saw Sihanouk as a relatively benign leader to have in Cambodia, so armed struggle was off the cards. The North Vietnamese said that the goal was to cooperate with and to support Sihanouk's government, which is following a policy of peace and neutrality. At the same time, they told the Cambodian Communist Party that they should fight against the meddling of American imperialism and its invasion of the region, and that they should struggle to eliminate or correct the negative aspects of the Sihanouk government which run counter to the people's interests. Philip Short characterizes this statement from the Vietnamese to the Cambodians as ambiguous and difficult to grasp, and apart from telling them that they should oppose the US, there was no real clear policy direction. He says that it was hardly going to mobilize enthusiasm for revolution in Cambodia, and, quote, it unashamedly sacrificed the Cambodian party's interests to those of Vietnam. And the Khmer communists would be stuck with this for the next 10 years. Neither the leaders and far less Salot Sa and the other returned students had any say in the matter. The eye of the storm had brought with it an eerie calm, the light breeze and blue skies. But if you were to glance further afield, it was plain to see that the hurricane was still gathering momentum. The moist, warm local air was still mixing with the cold, dry, and foreign pressures. And in the next part of this series, the Communist Party of Kampuchea, the Khmer Rouge, with all of this context baked into their worldview, will be established. Until then, this is Lachlan Peters. Thanks again for listening. Goodbye.